So this is the introduction to Chapter 3, how to use the supply and demand model. Supply and demand really captures all of economics. If you tell someone you're taking economics, they're very likely to say supply and demand in response. And that's because you can use that model to figure out your own life work history. You can use it to figure out how to make money in almost any industry. And there's a second part of it, which is the supply and demand model teaches you how to make decisions, which is why economics is a great discipline for everyone to learn. And the key to it is ceteris paribus, which is a Latin thing that means all other things equal, just change one thing at a time. So when we shift the supply curve or shift the demand curve or talk about even rotating them, then all those things are changing one thing and leaving everything else constant. So if you can get how to be an expert at supply and demand, A, you will improve your life, and B, you will know economics. So this chapter starts off talking about consumer surplus, which is the key to any market, which is why do people trade? Trading means you give money and the store gives you something, or Amazon gives you something. And the answer to that question is because you're better off doing it than doing it yourself. So we saw the silly example of the guy making a toaster in a year. It's a lot cheaper to just work for an hour and give the store money and get a toaster. So gains from trade is really what the economy is all about, and that's how we grow the economy, and you need to understand that really in its essence. So that starts with a demand curve. Demand curve depends on utility maximization, and we're going to study that really carefully in the next chapter. And then the complementary side to that is producer surplus, which is why are firms in business? Firms only sell things because the money they get is more than the cost that they incur, which tells you a key about what the supply curve is all about, which is costs. To the extent that the supply curve represents costs, that means the economy is doing a good job. To the extent that the supply curve depends on things besides costs, that's a bad sign for your economy. In this chapter 3, we're really talking about supply curve depending on costs. So producer surplus doesn't mean the firm is making more money than, quote, it should, unquote. That depends on how competitive the environment is. So a very important part of understanding that. There's two ways to look at these model of supply and demand. One is mathematically and the other is graphically. We're going to emphasize the graphs in class, but the book has some great examples of using a very simple math, and we'll talk about them a little bit. I will make you learn a little bit about how to find equilibrium. So the reason we use supply and demand is it predicts a price. We were saying that the goal of any model is A, to be simple, and B, to make valid predictions. Supply and demand is the perfect thing to study for that. And one of the predictions that comes out of supply and demand is the price. So following this example in the book and learning how to solve for an equilibrium price is crucial for you being an expert at economics, getting an A in the class. Then when you start thinking about price, you start thinking about what makes it change. Well, shifts in supply or shifts in demand are what make the equilibrium price change. The amount that price changes depends on elasticity. So this is a special word, we have a lot of vocabulary in economics that's not necessarily means the exact same thing as it does in everyday language. Elasticity means the propensity to change. How much does something change in response to some outside forces? So how much does price change if supply shifts or if demand shifts? And so there's many kinds of elasticity. There's elasticities of demand. And then when you think about elasticity of demand, there's a price elasticity of demand. There's an other price elasticity of demands, depending on whether other goods are complements or substitutes. There's an income elasticity of demand. And you can make up new ones all the time, and people do. So advertising expenditure elasticity of demand or other things like that. The other important part of it is opportunity cost, which is really one of the causes of elasticity. If you're in the market for a good, and you usually go to store A, and store A raises its price by 5%, are you going to keep going there or not? Depends on what your choices are, and that's what opportunity cost is. The markets are also important for understanding just our whole society about we're a market-based economy, but clearly some things are not done by markets. And so if you've been following the healthcare debate at all, this is a hugely important conversation about how much of healthcare should be allocated by markets and how much should be allocated by other processes, like the government or insurance companies or even your physician supplier group. You want to pay attention to why markets are important and what their advantages are and what their disadvantages are. So this book titled the chapter, The Advantages of the Market, because you need to understand that. The key to a market and understanding that part is gains from trade. And the opposite of gains from trade is deadweight loss. One of my favorite terms in economics because it just sounds so terrible to have deadweight loss. But in fact, what deadweight loss means is it's lost opportunities for gain. To understand that sentence, you have to be an expert in opportunity cost. So make sure you're good at doing that. So once you understand a market, supply, demand, equilibrium, the causes of shifts, and the gains from trade that result, then it's a really powerful tool for looking at lots of social policies. And the book does that to some extent. It talks about rent control. So, if you don't like the price of housing, can you keep the price of housing from going up? Well, like many social policies, it's not a free good. You can say it's illegal to raise the price, but other stuff happens. What might those things be? You can talk about price ceilings or price floors for lots of things. Everyone was mad at the guy that bought the EpiPens and raised the price by a lot. And that was a statement by the owner of EpiPens that he thought the demand was inelastic. You got to learn what that statement means. Inelastic means not very responsive to price. So if you raise the price a lot, your revenue is going to go up. There's other ways that societies and our governments have tried to control markets. So quotas is another one, allowing only a certain number of goods. That means you aren't necessarily using the market to find an equilibrium. And so that has implications for what the price is, what the gains from trade or deadweight losses are, and you need to understand that. Another excellent way to use the supply and demand model is to talk about taxes. And taxes are interesting because the way taxes are sold to the general public and the way they behave may not be the same. And supply and demand is an excellent way to look at that. And the key term is called incidence, which means who ultimately pays the tax. If we say that only firms pay taxes, does that mean that only firms pay taxes? Or do they raise the price and do the consumers pay the tax? Or do they change their profits and it's really the owners of the firm that are paying the tax? Or do they lower the wages and it's the workers that are paying the tax? All those are questions. The answers to those questions have to do with elasticity. And so this is why all of these parts are interrelated. And so you want to be really strong on the supply and demand model so you can understand what the processes are that goes in it, and so you can use it to talk about all this stuff, and we're going to do that. The other interesting flip side of taxes are subsidies. And so the same questions that arise for taxes arise for subsidies. If you subsidize a good, who actually benefits? If I subsidize the consumer, does it really enrich the firms, or does it actually help the consumer? And so that's an interesting thing to talk about. Just one current example is the Trump administration talked about eliminating the mortgage deduction for houses. Maybe you aren't paying income tax yet, you don't know all of the ins and outs of the income tax, but essentially it's been claimed that the consumers are subsidized, but in fact there's a fair question about what the incidence of that subsidy is. These are all terms that you need to be an expert at. So have fun with this chapter. Supply and demand is this just general tool, very powerful, and captures our whole economy.